Under the usual spotlight and familiar laughs, Conan O'Brien went beyond his typical comedy this time. In an unusual show of restraint, he spoke carefully about the rumors tied to a sensitive incident involving Rob Reiner's son, a story that has captured public interest but demands clear-eyed, fair, and balanced perspective. What exactly happened, and where does the boundary lie between verified facts and mere conjecture? If you're interested in more of his thoughtful, impartial takes on Hollywood's inner workings and celebrity lives, remember to like, subscribe, and enable notifications so you catch every new update. Conan himself acknowledged he was stepping into delicate territory by touching on this. He explained that the attention stemmed not from one isolated moment, but from a buildup of circumstances, mood, and emotional intensity that night, which fueled the wave of questions and rumors afterward, according to various unofficial reports. Conan hosted a private gathering that included Rob Reiner, his wife Michelle, and their son Nick. What started as a typical festive Hollywood get-together with soft lighting, easy chatter, and holiday cheer shifted unexpectedly. Guests later described how an undercurrent of unease built, especially in moments involving the Reiner family. Nick's demeanor reportedly unsettled people throughout the evening, not due to any single dramatic act, but from ongoing signs of emotional distress, pacing restlessly, cutting into conversations, and radiating a tense, unpredictable vibe that left others on edge. Some quietly moved away to avoid direct contact. The tension peaked with a heated, audible argument between Nick and his parents, loud enough to silence the room and make it clear this was no ordinary family spat. Laughter stopped, awkward glances were exchanged, and whispers spread among attendees about whether the situation might require outside intervention. Witnesses said some guests briefly considered calling for help, but the idea was quickly dropped. As host, Conan reportedly stepped in firmly, insisting no one dial 911. He didn't want police showing up at his home during what was meant to be a private, celebratory Christmas event. Those close to him later stressed that this wasn't about minimizing worries, but about avoiding a chaotic public scene with potential fallout for everyone involved. In the aftermath, details trickled out piecemeal through media and online chatter, mixing first-hand recollections with personal interpretations and outright speculation. That very murkiness has kept the story alive as a lingering, divisive topic, prompting caution from anyone revisiting it. Eyewitnesses noted Conan explicitly told people not to call emergency services, prioritizing privacy over escalation in what still felt at the moment like a tense but not immediately life-threatening family dispute. In hindsight, though, many have second-guessed that choice. Authorities later confirmed no 911 calls originated from Conan's residence that night. Less than 24 hours later, devastating news emerged. Witnesses and reports from the scene ... Reports from the event indicate that Nick Reiner repeatedly approached numerous attendees at the gathering, posing questions that left many feeling uneasy, such as repeatedly asking, "Are you famous?" This took place at a private party attended predominantly by well-known figures from the entertainment world, individuals who are typically accustomed to fame and eccentric conduct. Yet, in this intimate professional setting among peers, his persistent behavior generated significant discomfort and embarrassment. According to multiple witnesses, Nick did not limit his interactions to just a handful of people. Instead, he targeted several prominent guests. In later interviews, those present described the atmosphere as profoundly odd. Amid a crowd of celebrities, the ongoing inquiries about their celebrity status felt oddly confrontational and inexplicable. Some noted that such questions might seem reasonable at a typical mixed-crowd event with only one or two famous people surrounded by strangers, but here, among industry insiders, it struck everyone as bizarre and disturbing. The subsequent tragedy triggered intense examination of every aspect of that evening. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were discovered deceased in their Brentwood residence, with authorities swiftly ruling the deaths as homicides, sending shockwaves through Hollywood. Their eldest son, Nick Reiner, was taken into custody and formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Prosecutors stated that the killings occurred in the early morning hours shortly after the family departed the party. Nick has not yet entered a formal plea, and the investigation and legal process remain ongoing. Yet speculation about the events leading up to it continues to trouble those who attended. Once the details emerged, online platforms and entertainment Media erupted with discussions, timeline breakdowns, and a flood of competing theories. Painful questions surfaced. Could someone have stepped in earlier? Might the outcome have been averted? Mental health specialists, however, have cautioned against oversimplification, stressing that even when red flags appear, foreseeing and preventing extreme violence is extraordinarily challenging, often impossible. Retired law enforcement professionals have added that involving police does not reliably avert tragedy in volatile, emotionally charged family dynamics. This reality deepens the sorrow as it suggests that intervention at the moment might not have altered the result if underlying problems remained unaddressed. Associates of Conan O'Brien promptly clarified that he faces no accusations of misconduct. They insist that full responsibility lies solely with the individual who carried out the act, and urge restraint and speculation during the active investigation. Defenders of O'Brien contend that any decision to discourage guests from contacting authorities stemmed from intense pressure and was an instinctive reaction in the moment, one where no one could have foreseen the devastating events that followed. One attendee reportedly offered a succinct yet powerful statement: only the person who committed the violence should bear accountability. Even so, that same individual acknowledged that the night continues to haunt everyone present, leaving them wrestling with torturous questions about alternative paths, the lingering uncertainty about whether different actions could have changed. Anything still echoes throughout the industry. This pain intensified with revelations that Rob Reiner privately shared fears for his son's well-being, and possibly his own safety, with a small circle of trusted friends during the party. These admissions, later shared at a private memorial, reportedly moved many to tears. The notion that Rob may have sensed impending danger, feeling caught between quiet dread and unspoken uncertainty, proved deeply unsettling. Although some spokespeople sought to minimize or dispute parts of these reports, the emotional impact only grew stronger over time. The idea that Rob lived with real fear in his final hours has only amplified public curiosity and grief. People have obsessively revisited every interaction, look, and word from those last moments, attempting to reconstruct the puzzle of what occurred. As the official inquiry proceeds and court proceedings advance, rather than subsiding, the strain has only mounted. What were once viewed as minor, forgettable episodes at Conan O'Brien's holiday gathering now carry profound, ominous weight. They stand as a stark reminder that an apparently innocuous choice amid tension can assume a far more sinister significance in hindsight after catastrophe strikes. That single decision to de-escalate quietly rather than escalate externally continues to be dissected relentlessly, with every nuance examined under intense scrutiny. Profound, unresolved questions persist. The questions linger painfully. Could someone have stepped in earlier? Were there clear warning signs that went unnoticed or were downplayed? These reflections bring no solace, only a stark realization. Even people teetering on the edge can fail to grasp how serious things have become until it is far too late. The tragedy sent continuing shockwaves through Hollywood for weeks afterward. Close sources indicated that friction between Nick Reiner and his parents had been building quietly for months leading up to the party. People who knew the Reiner family acknowledged that Nick's behavior had raised concerns before that night. Yet no one foresaw anything approaching this level of catastrophe. At the time, those signs were viewed as troubling rather than harbingers of disaster, and that gap in perception makes the outcome feel even more devastating in hindsight. Friends of the family say Rob Reiner did everything he could to support and steer his son, offering guidance and help discreetly behind the scenes. To the outside world, the family projected stability, but insiders describe a private situation that was steadily worsening. The sharp contrast between Rob's composed public persona and the mounting distress at home has become a central point of discussion. Conan O'Brien, according to those close to him, has been deeply shaken and has largely avoided the press. Friends portray him as grieving, stunned, and struggling to make sense of how an evening met for laughter, connection, and celebration turned to the beginning of an irreversible nightmare. As the investigation presses forward, Hollywood remains in a state of uneasy suspense, waiting for credible new developments. Leaked messages, unreleased video clips, and conflicting versions of events are quietly circulating among journalists. The public and the industry desperately wants clarity. What actually occurred, who saw what, and what words were exchanged. Yet many pivotal facts remain unverified. And the narrative grows murkier with each new rumor. Media outlets chase exclusives while self-described insiders offer competing accounts, making it increasingly difficult to separate fact from speculation. Unconfirmed reports have mentioned a possible heated exchange involving another well-known guest shortly before events spiraled. No names have been officially linked to that claim. Investigators have reportedly reached out to several attendees, requesting photos, videos, and text messages from the evening. One source said to be familiar with the inquiry claims detectives are pursuing a potentially decisive audio or video recording of a critical moment, one that could significantly change the understood timeline and reveal the degree of strain. In the moments before the Reiner family left the gathering, online communities have erupted with speculation, ranging from plausible social and psychological interpretations to far-fetched conspiracy theories. What started as a private family loss has morphed into a sprawling Hollywood enigma, leaving the public simultaneously fascinated and unsettled. Amid the swirl of conjecture, broader conversations have surfaced about the unique pressures borne by children of celebrity parents. Several voices have noted that telling the truth can sometimes feel less daunting than enduring the world's harsh, judgmental scrutiny where personal pain is quickly reduced to gossip or moralizing. Even so, some friends have tried to refocus attention on the human core of the story. Those who knew Rob and Michelle Reiner describe them as genuinely warm, quietly funny, and fiercely loyal people whose presence alone could make any room feel kinder and safer. The idea that their final hours were filled with terror and sorrow remains almost unbearable to many who love them. Legally, Nick Reiner's defense team is said to be building a case centered on long-standing mental health struggles, potentially arguing that the events stemmed from a catastrophic breakdown rather than intentional conduct. Prosecutors, however, are expected to push back forcefully, contending that forthcoming evidence will demonstrate premeditation as these competing narratives take shape and the emotional toll of the case continues to mount. A noticeable hush has fallen over much of the entertainment world. Many prominent figures have stayed silent, seemingly wordless in the face of an event that has replaced Hollywood's usual sheen with grief and disbelief. At the same time, whispers of a possible bombshell interview are gaining traction. Unverified reports suggest that one party guest who observed several tense exchanges has agreed to speak on camera, with discussions allegedly underway with a major streaming service. Even before any agreement is finalized, the prospective sit-down is already being described in some circles as explosive. If it airs, many believe it could surface previously unknown details about the night's sequence of events. Behind the locked doors of the mansion, intense discussions continue about whether certain private details from that night should ever be made public. Some critics condemn the idea of exposing intimate moments as a violation of privacy, while others insist that only full transparency will allow the public to grasp the complete truth. Whatever side ultimately wins out, the focus remains firmly on what comes next. Any major disclosure has the potential to send the entire narrative spinning in an entirely different direction. Conan O'Brien, for his part, has stayed silent. He has canceled appearances, stepped away from public life, and largely retreated from view. Close friends describe him as devastated, grappling with profound sadness, guilt, and the weight of a single evening that is now burned into his memory. Forever. In Hollywood, the mood is described as heavy and oppressive. Whispers circulate about who is shielding whom, what is still being hidden, and what might yet surface. The story is clearly far from finished. The investigation remains active. More witnesses are expected to step forward, and the media storm shows no signs of letting up. With each passing day come fresh headlines, new rumors, and additional layers of darkness, added to an already intricate and painful puzzle. Authorities have declined to comment on emerging evidence, but speculation is growing that detectives are closely examining security camera footage from the property where the party was held. Their reported aim is to establish the precise moment the Reiner family departed that night, a timeline that could either corroborate certain accounts or force a wholesale rethinking of what people thought they knew. Many who were there that evening are still processing what happened, mentally replaying conversations and interactions that once seemed trivial but now carry heavy significance. Some guests say the experience has prompted deeper reflection on the pressures others carry and on their own sense of personal responsibility. For a number, the emotional fallout has dragged on for months, marked by stress, exhaustion, and ultimately a shift in how they approach relationships and accountability. At the same time, several attendees have quietly retained private attorneys, worried they could be pulled further into a case that keeps growing more complicated. Hollywood has weathered countless scandals, yet insiders say few have blended fame, family ties, and tragedy quite so hauntingly. Even veteran industry figures admit to being stunned by how rapidly events unfolded and by the lingering sense that many secrets have yet to surface. As the initial wave of shock recedes, the industry finds itself standing amid the wreckage of what was meant to be a joyful Christmas celebration, now the origin point of a double tragedy that has left deep scars. The episode has come to serve as a sobering reminder of how fragile reputations and lives can be when crisis collides with celebrity. Conan O'Brien continues to keep a low profile, reportedly spending his time in quiet reflection, leaning on a small circle of trusted friends, and staying far from the public eye while every detail of that night remains under intense scrutiny. The ripple effects are unmistakable. Private events are being canceled, stars are tightening security and rethinking who they let close, and studio executives are said to be uneasy that old associations or decisions could suddenly resurface. What began as one family's tragedy has morphed into a broader reckoning, one that is forcing Hollywood to confront its culture of silence, pressure, and avoidance. Attention is now shifting toward the courtroom and whatever unfolds in the closed door. Legal battles ahead. Prosecutors are reportedly assembling detailed timelines, digital records, and witness statements, painstakingly reviewing every text, every movement, and every minute of that fateful evening. Witnesses, meanwhile, are described as torn caught between self-preservation and the urge to speak truthfully, a conflict that has brought sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. Without question, the case has entered a new and more serious phase. The raw shock may have faded, but the long-term consequences are only beginning to reveal themselves. As legal proceedings move forward and testimonies are formally entered, the entire industry is holding its breath, aware that a single new piece of information could upend everything once again. Time has passed since that fateful night, yet the emotional fallout shows no signs of fading. Many guests from the event have reportedly pulled back from social circles, skipping public appearances, dodging cameras, and shunning media attention. According to friends, a quiet but pervasive anxiety has taken hold, leading people to comb through past conversations, seemingly innocent texts, and moments once dismissed as insignificant. Even seasoned Hollywood insiders have confided privately about how deeply the incident has shaken them. What surfaced wasn't merely an isolated tragedy, it exposed a more systemic problem in the entertainment world, a culture where troubling behavior is too often excused, minimized, or quietly overlooked to preserve an illusion of harmony. This growing unease has prompted some prominent figures to privately reflect on their own actions and complicity, even if they're not prepared to speak out publicly. While media coverage hasn't waned, the continued silence from key players has only amplified the discomfort. Every unanswered question and every avoided statement heightens the strain. Hollywood is no longer a mere spectator. It's immersed in a state of quiet dread. Bracing for whatever revelations might emerge next, attention is now turning to the lasting repercussions, not just the legal ones still unfolding around Nick Reiner, but the profound emotional and cultural ripples. Crisis teams, therapists, and industry consultants are discreetly studying the case as a textbook example of how private struggles can erupt into a full-blown public disaster. A stark realization is taking root. Fame doesn't shield someone from consequences. It often magnifies them. Behind closed doors, numerous entertainment families are said to be confronting long-avoided discussions about personal boundaries, inappropriate interference, and the damage caused by prolonged silence. The deepest impact lies in the widespread sense that this event will linger far beyond the news cycle, not as passing gossip, but as a permanent wake-up call embedded in Hollywood's shared consciousness. Even as productions continue and cameras keep rolling, that single night will continue to influence how people view power dynamics, accountability, and early red flags. The legal case involving Nick Reiner remains far from resolution, with unpredictable twists still possible. Insiders caution that additional disturbing details could surface as proceedings advance. The public watches closely, seeking clarity. Yet a true conclusion feels distant. At its core, This isn't merely another celebrity scandal or routine Hollywood drama. When Romy Reiner first spoke publicly, fragments long concealed beneath the Reiner family's polished image began to emerge. In startling ways. Her account was measured rather than accusatory, a calm, unflinching examination that exposed inconsistencies, unspoken fears, and troubling patterns around Nick that the public had never glimpsed. The further one looks, the more unsettling the picture becomes, raising painful questions. At what point does protecting family unity cross into shielding the truth? I wasn't drawn to elaborate breakdowns or clinical details. What stays with me most vividly is the raw emotion. They carried more feeling, more genuine humanity than almost anyone I'd encountered in Los Angeles. Each morning, my parents would greet the day with warm smiles and say, "It's a beautiful day." Back then, I didn't fully grasp what they meant. Their home in Brentwood felt open and free, full of affection, yet strangely undefined, as though love and independence had no firm edges. Maybe that stemmed from how I was raised, where structure often gave way to openness without clear limits. Then, in the span of just a few days, that familiar peace in Brentwood was violently broken by an unthinkable event. At the heart of it stood Romy Reiner. The young woman stood frozen in the familiar ruins of her childhood home. A space that once echoed with joy but now felt chilling and strange. A thick, oppressive quiet settled over everything, and Romy struggled to stay upright as the devastating reality hit her. Life had shifted irreversibly in a single moment. When emergency responders arrived and verified that a grave crime had taken place, the shock consumed her entirely. Supported as she was led away, her complexion ashen, hands shaking uncontrollably, her speech disjointed and frantic. Witnesses described her as moving through a haze, physically present, yet mentally distant, lost in another world. In her terror and distress, she kept repeating one desperate request: to prevent Nick from vanishing, to keep him from disappearing. Those pleas lingered hauntingly down the hospital hallways, carrying an eerie, unspoken weight even after her vital signs steadied. Romy's thoughts stayed locked in that horrific instant, endlessly looping through the sights and emotions she couldn't shake. Then the press descended, microphones and cameras flashing relentlessly amid a storm of questions. Finally, Romy spoke. Her statement both poignant and explosive. She confessed that unintentionally she'd played a part in the sequence of events that culminated in the disaster. This admission flipped the narrative overnight, compelling everyone to scrutinize the full sequence of events through an entirely new lens. Not long afterward came the highly anticipated sit-down interview. The polished facade of the Reiner family began to fracture, exposing long-buried cracks that had persisted beneath years of cheerful images and public warmth. One late afternoon, with daylight dimming beyond the glass, Romy's phone buzzed with a message that pierced her chest. Her parents weren't picking up calls. In that instant, dread confirmed the worst she sensed: catastrophe. And her world was on the verge of permanent rupture. Across the divide, Rob had reached his limit too. Not through explosive rage, but via a deep, accumulated frost born from dream. Years of quietly managing crises that weren't his own. For so long, he had covered for Nick, calmed storms, defended him, and mopped up messes others dodged. But this time, the final strand broke. He resolved to step back. No more alerts, no more shields, no further rescue. It started with one brief, resolute text. Rob gazed at his screen, finger hovering over send, as though this was his last chance to waver. The words were concise yet carried the full weight of suppressed pain and disillusionment accumulated over time. From then on, those around him noticed the transformation. Rob grew more reserved, withdrew from connections, deleted traces of the caches of the past, and started facing the realities Nick had concealed for years. Some speculated he had uncovered something profoundly damaging enough to demolish the polished persona Nick maintained. Others thought Rob's deliberate withdrawal itself sparked Nick's paranoia, leaving him scanning surroundings nervously, eyes fixed on his phone, terrified of missing any sign. Once Romy went public with her account, online speculation about a deep fracture between Rob and Nick ignited instantly. Circulated screenshots, wild conjectures, and rumored messages fueled theories of a far larger hidden truth than anyone had imagined. The most jarring claims soon surfaced. Rob wasn't merely distancing himself, he aimed to eliminate Nick from his existence altogether. Insiders claimed he described it as starting fresh. Whatever the phrasing, one detail stood clear. He expressed no remorse. Their bond disintegrated swiftly after that final exchange. Nick was shattered. The one person he had relied on without question had turned icy in an instant. Calls, messages, even in-person attempts all met with unrelenting quiet. That silence carried menace, not mere dismissal. Nick felt it acutely. Those who knew him observed his visible unraveling. Erratic pacing through Los Angeles streets, perpetual phone checking as though bracing for the blow. One contact remarked that whatever Rob had learned was grave enough to rob Nick of rest. In stark contrast, Rob proceeded with careful restraint, almost excessive. This wasn't a simple break. It was a methodical rewrite. He scrubbed online footprints, reconnected selectively with distant contacts, and severed lingering links. Rumors swirled that he quietly fed details to media outlets anonymously, aiming to surface the facts without stepping into the spotlight. Social media seized the story, transforming their estrangement into one of entertainment's most dissected enigmas. When Romy faced the lenses again, her voice quivered at the mention of either name. Her gaze conveyed depths words couldn't capture. What unfolded was no ordinary domestic sorrow. It was layered with disloyalty, dread, and the explosive collision of concealed truths. She subtly suggested Rob's choice arose not from vengeance, but from a protective instinct shielding against an unnamed danger too perilous to voice aloud. By week's end, the same question consumed every discussion. What exactly had Rob uncovered, and to what lengths would he go to stop it from inflicting further damage? The rift between Rob and Nick had grown so deep that it felt irreversible. Those close to them could sense the heavy, uneasy atmosphere where long silences mingled with unspoken distrust. Rob gradually vanished from his usual social circles. He stopped showing up at events, quit partying, withdrew from friends, and left almost no digital or public footprint. Nick, meanwhile, appeared trapped in a downward spiral of paranoia and distress. He became convinced that Rob was orchestrating something major behind the scenes. People around him described him as perpetually on edge, distracted, jumpy, always bracing for disaster. Soon, fragments of the past began resurfacing. Several people recalled that Nick had struggled with serious anger issues since he was young, sometimes requiring others to step in to calm him. These old stories spread rapidly, even without any official corroboration. The internet eagerly amplified everything. Screenshots, unverified audio clips, vague or ominous posts, and fresh rumors flooded timelines daily. Some claimed Rob had quietly hired a private security firm. Others insisted he had been collecting evidence for months. None of it was confirmed, yet each new whisper only deepened the mystery. Online sleuths turned into amateur investigators. They unearthed years-old photographs, dissected facial expressions, cross-referenced timelines, and hunted for the exact moment the relationship began to fracture. The more they searched, the clearer it became. This was far more layered and complicated than the surface suggested. Than an old video clip unexpectedly re-emerged, a recording from a charity event held shortly before the fallout. In the footage, Rob and Nick appear relaxed, laughing and chatting easily, giving no hint of trouble. But toward the end, the camera catches Rob staring straight into the lens and saying, in a calm but haunting tone, "One day everyone will know who I really am." The line exploded across the internet. Was it a throwaway remark, dark humor, or something far more foreboding? From that moment, public perception of the entire situation began to shift. Around the same time, Romy Reiner was pulled into the center of the storm. In a recent interview, she revealed that the connection between the two men and her family ran much deeper than most people realized. She described Rob not as merely angry, but genuinely afraid, fear that felt like watching an unstoppable tragedy draw closer. That single comment reframed everything. What had looked like a straightforward personal feud suddenly appeared as a dense knot of buried secrets, fractured loyalties, and quiet betrayals playing out away from public view. What unsettled people most was Rob's complete public silence. Weeks passed with no interviews, no posts, no explanations. To many, that absence spoke louder than any statement could. By contrast, Nick seemed to be unraveling quickly. The once assured, charismatic persona was gone, replaced by exhaustion, visible unease, and a haunted look in his eyes. Close contacts said he rarely left home, canceled nearly every commitment, and suffered from severe insomnia. He reportedly told people he could feel Rob getting closer, Convinced his time was running out, whispers grew that Rob wasn't actually hiding, he was preparing. Some said he had deliberately stepped out of sight, severed most ties, and was quietly consulting people skilled at handling delicate matters discreetly. There were unconfirmed sightings of him in San Diego meeting a high-profile attorney. Others speculated he was assembling a dossier that could dramatically alter how the public saw Nick. Whatever the reality, almost everyone sensed that something powerful was building beneath the calm exterior. Romy then dropped another bombshell. She stated that Nick had pressured her to stay silent about a sensitive family issue, and that Rob had eventually learned the truth. That was the turning point, she said, her voice breaking. According to her, Rob's actions weren't driven by spite. He simply wanted the facts exposed, no matter the cost. Her words spread instantly across headlines and feeds. Overnight, the narrative flipped. Rob, long viewed as someone overshadowed by Nick, began to be seen as a man on a determined, almost solitary quest for truth. A new moniker started circulating online and quickly attached itself to Rob. No one knew his exact whereabouts or next move, but a growing consensus held that when he finally acted, it would not be quiet. By the 6th week, anticipation had reached fever pitch. Social media, forums, blogs, and niche news sites all circled the same questions. Where is Rob? What is he planning? Every grainy photo and anonymous lead was dissected. Some theorized he was traveling under an alias. Others swore they had spotted him near Nick's former studio after dark. Meanwhile, Nick's once tightly run world appeared to be collapsing inward. His team had gone strangely quiet. Even his media manager had. Rob vanished from public view. And one after another, his social media profiles went dark or were deactivated. Then, for a fleeting moment, a mysterious post surfaced before it was swiftly removed. A stark black screen bearing just 3 words. He warned you. The online world erupted in speculation. Was this Rob's doing or Nick attempting to seize control of the narrative? Attention locked onto it immediately. Romy soon returned with even more explosive revelations. She revealed that Rob had uncovered messages proving Nick's deception went far beyond broken trust. He wasn't merely lying, Romy stated, her voice shaking. He was constructing an entire alternate reality. That line raced across entertainment. Headlines within hours, then came an ominous quiet. No fresh leaks, no updates, no signs of life. Insiders claimed Rob had gone completely off-grid to finish what he saw as essential. To him, this was his endgame. The phrase "he warned you" ignited like wildfire across the internet, fueling endless theories and debates. Weeks later, just as the frenzy began to fade, fragments of Rob's larger strategy started coming to light. It grew evident that severing ties with Nick wasn't merely about distance. Sources described it as a battle for control. Rob had reportedly sought advice from multiple specialists, weighing options for Nick's need for extended, serious intervention. To the outside world, it appeared rooted in sincere worry, like a family member desperate to rescue someone lost. Yet behind the scenes, the reality was far murkier. According to those close to the situation, Rob had quietly investigated and lined up a discreet, long-term rehabilitation facility far removed from Los Angeles. He confided to a handful of trusted people that this was Nick's best shot at stability, time away from destructive influences to rebuild. What unsettled many was Rob's apparent certainty that Nick would never come back. For Rob, this wasn't only about aid. It was about breaking a destructive pattern once and for all and restoring calm for everyone involved. Romy later shared that, days before events spiraled, Rob had opened up to her in exhaustion. He admitted he was tired of shielding them, that all he wanted now was peace. In hindsight, those words carried a much darker implication. Meanwhile, Nick started picking up on the shift. Rob grew remote and eerily composed, the demeanor of someone who had already resolved to act decisively. One acquaintance noted that Nick felt the orchestration unfolding. He knew something major was in motion. In hushed discussions, Nick's mental health emerged as a central topic. Some saw it as context or even justification for his actions. Others insisted that insight into someone's struggles does not erase accountability. If a person understands their choices and their fallout, they remain responsible. At this juncture, the dynamic quietly pivoted. What started as a low-key strategy evolved into a wordless standoff between 2 people who had once regarded each other as kin. Tension mounted steadily, leaving followers gripped by one question: what comes next? How will Nick respond once he grasps Rob's real plan? The air between them thickened with unspoken menace, even silence felt loaded and dangerous. Rob spoke with deliberate calm, measuring every phrase as though still in command. He told Nick about a secluded spot where he could rest, heal, and begin a fresh start. On the surface, it sounded compassionate. To Nick, though, it rang like a gentle goodbye. Rob's mind was made up, and Nick could sense it clearly. Nick grew skeptical of the reassurances. Something in Rob's tone felt off, unlike the man who had so often urged him to steer clear of trouble. Witnesses to their interactions noticed the change. Nick's eyes turned weary and guarded, tracking Rob as if anticipating the moment the mask would drop. One friend remembered Nick muttering that he wouldn't be dismissed so easily. Rob pressed ahead, quietly arranging logistics, booking flights, insisting on secrecy, convinced that Nick's departure would finally bring tranquility. Yet the more Nick mulled over the proposal, the more trapped he felt. What Rob viewed as salvation, Nick saw as exile and betrayal from the person he had relied on most. Then, just when the plan appeared locked in, Nick's response stunned everyone. What happened? Next reportedly shattered the calm of the neighborhood. Brentwood was thrust back into the spotlight, and Rob's meticulous scheme veered into far grimmer territory than he could have foreseen. On the eve of Nick's scheduled departure, an unnatural stillness settled over the house. Rob tried to maintain normalcy, chatting about fresh possibilities, new chapters, even cooking dinner as though grasping at faded routine. But beneath every sentence lay an undercurrent of finality. A quiet but dangerous tension had been building. Rob was convinced he still held the reins, that Nick had quietly accepted the arrangement. He failed to see that Nick's prolonged silence was not surrender, but the calm before deliberate action. That night, Nick vanished for hours without explanation. When he finally returned, his gaze was empty yet unnaturally sharp, carrying the unmistakable weight of someone who had crossed an irreversible line. Rob at first registered nothing unusual. The stillness even felt like confirmation that his plan was unfolding smoothly. Later, Romy would recall the message she had sent that same night. She had written that Nick's eerie composure filled her with dread. It was the look of a person who had already made up his mind and was simply biding time until the moment to act. Not defeat, but cold, patient calculation. As darkness settled, Rob sat alone under the desk lamp, shadows falling across meticulously organized documents. He went over every element of the forthcoming journey one last time. Flight confirmations, clinic details, accommodation bookings, paperwork, each piece locked into place with clinical precision. In his mind, this was not a plot but closure. If Nick could be removed from the equation, the years of disorder would finally end and life could regain its old shape. What Rob never suspected was that Nick already knew. The supposedly discreet emails, the booking records Rob thought were invisible, the scattered clues he believed he had buried, Nick had uncovered them all. The realization struck like ice. This was not assistance or worry. It was expulsion. Carefully orchestrated, betrayal flooded through him, shattering the last thin threads of trust. Long-buried pain, humiliation, rage, and the suffocating sense of being trapped detonated together with nowhere to go. According to neighbors who later spoke to reporters, the house grew strangely noisy that night, sharp, disordered sounds drifting through the dark, then a violent crash of something breaking, followed by an oppressive, heavy quiet that felt more ominous than peace. At first light, the neighborhood was jolted awake by sirens. Blue and red lights swept across streets that had always symbolized safety. As morning sun touched the rooftops, the same question echoed in many minds. If Rob had simply been truthful from the beginning, if he had not tried to act as both rescuer and executioner, would events have spiraled to this point? Inside, the house was unrecognizable. Papers lay strewn across floors, suitcases upended, possessions scattered in every direction, clear evidence of a sudden explosive confrontation. The illusion of control Rob had clung to was gone. He was discovered injured, drained, but breathing. Paramedics rushed him away while a storm of unanswered questions remained hanging in the air. When Rob finally came to, the hospital room was unnaturally still. Then, in a hoarse whisper that chilled everyone present, he spoke 4 words. He knows. Nick knows everything. Those few syllables carried terror, grief, and the total disintegration of the plan he had built so carefully. Outside, Romy faced the cameras looking hollowed out. Her voice shook as she said Rob had only wanted to make things right, but the entire effort had been doomed almost from the first step. She would say little more, yet her exhausted expression and rigid posture told the rest of the story. She acknowledged the mounting strain she had felt, never dreaming it would detonate so brutally. As investigators pieced the timeline together, the picture grew stark: encrypted messages, clinic appointments, flight reservations, a detailed exit strategy, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Rob's attempt to surgically remove Nick from his life had instead triggered a violent implosion. The press descended quickly. Public fascination was intense. One question towered over every conversation. Had Rob's decision to force Nick out finally snapped something that had been under unbearable pressure for years? Or had the eruption simply been inevitable, only waiting for the right spark? The narrative turned far bleaker than anyone had anticipated, and it was obvious the full story was still unfolding. In the days that followed, their faces and names saturated every screen and headline. Reporters camped outside, broadcasts looped the same grainy footage, as though an entire society were holding its breath for an explanation that might never come. Behind the scenes, police reconstructed the night through call logs and timestamps. They found several outgoing calls from Rob after the confrontation, one tied directly to the original plan, one to a lawyer, and one unanswered call placed to Romy. That misconnection quickly became the detail everyone fixated on: a last-second doubt? An aborted warning? A flicker of remorse too late to matter? Rob, so far, had offered no answers. Meanwhile, Nick had completely disappeared without a trace. There was no confirmation of his whereabouts, no communication, just faint whispers and hearsay. Some people said they'd spotted him slipping away under the cover of night, heading far, off into the horizon. Others thought he'd vanished right before sunrise. None of it could be confirmed. It was as though he'd carried away all the secrets with him and evaporated into nothingness. Ultimately, Romy released a brief statement expressing her wish for the truth to come to light soon. Yet, rather than clearing up the confusion, her words only deepened the enigma. As fresh information kept surfacing, folks started viewing the whole saga through a fresh lens. Maybe it wasn't just about deceit or vengeance. Perhaps on a more profound level, it was a desperate fight for self-preservation, where each person thought they were making the moral choice in a scenario that had spun wildly out of hand. Music, without question, key elements of the bigger picture were still absent. The full reality hadn't surfaced yet, and once it did, it might append all prior assumptions. Days turned into weeks, but Nick showed no definitive signs of reappearing. The extended uncertainty left the entire town on edge. News trucks crowded outside the police headquarters, their lenses perpetually aimed in one direction. Internet forums overflowed with hypotheses, guesses, and debates. Every news channel spun its own narrative, each one shaded differently, muddling the boundary between fact and fiction. Amid the clamor of the excited masses, the detectives proceeded methodically and discreetly. Inch by inch, they were approaching a revelation that was both significant and unsettling. Upon examining Rob's phone and computer, they uncovered a series of erased voicemails, all originating from Nick. The messages were brief, yet brimming with strain, hopelessness, and suppressed feelings. In one recording, Nick's voice shook as he said, "You can't save me, Rob. You're burying me." That line brought the room to a hush. It exposed a facet of Nick that no one had fully grasped before. He wasn't merely feeling betrayed, he felt ensnared, backed into a corner where fighting back appeared to be his sole escape. Romy was summoned for additional interrogation, and her disclosure shocked many. She disclosed that shortly before the chaos erupted, Rob had confided in her about setting up a plan to finally achieve resolution. At the moment, she assumed he simply aimed to dissolve the ongoing friction, not to eliminate Nick from the equation. "If I'd realized his true intentions," Romy stated, her tone laced with sorrow, "I never would have allowed it to escalate like this." These revelations circulated swiftly, altering public opinions on the matter. Empathy, doubt, and debate merged quickly, and digital sleuths persisted in probing further, assembling chronologies and scrutinizing every tiny aspect. Certain discoveries implied that Nick might have harbored his own alternative scheme. Some speculated he'd left a parting hint, an undiscovered lead. At this stage, the situation had escaped anyone's grasp. It transcended a mere clash or private feud. It had evolved into a tale of deceit, a cascade of miscommunications, and a sequence of poor decisions. Law enforcement suggested that vital details were on the verge of disclosure, heightening the air of expectancy. Everyone was fixated on their devices, knowing that linking those last fragments could overhaul the narrative entirely. In Brentwood, the strain refused to ease. If anything, it intensified, as if infiltrating every avenue and residence. It hung heavy in the atmosphere. A rift had formed within the Reiner family, and its depth remained unknown. Officials labeled the event as a domestic dispute, but insiders murmured that the reality was much more intricate. Mysterious marks, the crash of shattering glass late at night, and quiet sobs painted a picture that succinct media updates couldn't capture. Romy dodged the press, striving to stay composed amid the swirling gossip. Some thought Rob and Nick had patched things up discreetly. Others alleged a fresh clash had taken place. Maybe the facts resided in the middle ground between those extremes. Rob slowly recuperated in his home, though acquaintances noted he hardly rested. He kept glancing about as if sensing the ordeal wasn't concluded. Meanwhile, Nick operated in the shadows. No phone calls, no messages, yet sporadic reports of him emerged. Deserted coffee shops, midnight road trips, motels under assumed names. He hadn't fully vanished, he was simply hovering at the edges of the unfolding drama. Insiders mentioned that Nick no longer displayed rage. He was composed, eerily so. And that serenity unnerved those nearby more than anything. Companions urged Romy to depart the area to seek a secluded spot for refuge. She declined. "I can't abandon my family," she murmured. She clung to the hope of reconciliation, but inwardly she knew Nick had transformed. As holiday illuminations started brightening Brentwood, the Reiner residents stayed enveloped in gloom. No comfort, no festivity, just an enduring quiet. Neighbors murmured the same query too. Mutual suspicion poisoned the air between them. Where had Nick gone, and what exactly was he waiting for? Even the glow of the streetlights couldn't dispel the thick, oppressive atmosphere that clung to the house. Rob almost never left. When he did, his outings were brief, his gaze constantly scanning. Indoors, the quiet felt crushing, almost unbearable. Romy decorated a modest Christmas tree, an earnest but brutal effort to cling to some semblance of ordinary life. Rob spent hours motionless, eyes fixed on his phone, anticipating a text that never came. Nick had gone completely silent. Not a single message. Yet his absence didn't feel like departure. One night Romy caught the crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway, followed by the soft groan of the gate. Her stomach dropped. Peering into the yard revealed only shadows. Rob tried to dismiss it, but the color had drained from his face. When he reviewed the security footage and found a suspicious gap in the recording, genuine dread settled over him. The following morning, a neighbor casually mentioned spotting the familiar car idling at the far end of the street once more. Rob stayed quiet, but Romy recognized the raw, unguarded fear in his expression. The fragile calm they had maintained was gone. Something final and unstoppable was closing in. December 14th became a date etched in memory. The night was unnaturally still, as though the entire city had paused, waiting for an inevitable fracture. Inside the house, weeks of restrained tension finally erupted. Later, neighbors described hearing a tense, low-voiced argument that dragged on for almost an hour before collapsing into an abrupt, suffocating hush. No one knew precisely what unfolded behind those walls. They only knew that by morning the house felt irrevocably altered, once warm and lived in, now strangely hollow and a strange. When Romy returned that morning and discovered the front door unlocked, a wave of dread hit her instantly. She called out names. Silence answered. The instant she understood something was terribly wrong, she froze. Then her scream ripped through the quiet street. Police arrived swiftly, sealing off the property. Romy, numb with shock, was taken to receive medical care, unable to process the scene she had walked into. Investigators quickly established there were no signs of a break-in. That single fact opened a chilling possibility. The perpetrator had been invited in or already belonged inside. Suspicion turned toward Nick almost immediately. He had not vanished, nor had he fled the area. When officers located him, he was sitting alone in a modest hotel room nearby, staring vacantly at the wall. His expression was eerily composed, almost detached. The television flickered soundlessly. On the table beside him lay several carefully arranged family photographs. He offered no resistance, showed no surprise, displayed no agitation when the police entered. To those present, it felt less like an arrest and more like collecting someone who had already surrendered internally. One officer later remarked that Nick's body was in the room, but the rest of him seemed to have drifted somewhere far away. Forensic traces recovered from the bathroom and a towel established a clear link to the events at the Reiner residence. Throughout questioning, Nick remained blank, neither panicked nor defensive nor eager to explain. When read his rights and asked whether he understood them, he murmured a quiet yes and then said nothing more. Romy was still in the hospital when she learned her brother was in custody. Those around her were startled by her response. No sobs, no collapse, just a long, distant stare and a soft whisper. He wouldn't hurt anyone. Yet beneath the words, something in her seemed to finally acknowledge a truth she had spent months refusing to see. The investigation moved rapidly. Detectives confirmed Nick had left the house late that night and checked into the nearby hotel alone. Surveillance footage captured him entering, calm and wearing the same clothing from earlier. When those details became public, disbelief rippled outward. Nick Reiner, once viewed as steady, magnetic, unbreakable, was now the quiet center of an incomprehensible tragedy. Headlines circled the same unanswered questions. What really transpired in those final hours? What was said in the darkness of that house? And what final pressure caused everything to break irreversibly? In the weeks that followed, Romy retreated entirely from view. Reporters waited in vain for any comment. She gave no interviews, made no statements. Many assumed grief had silenced her, and they were partly right. But privately she was doing something else entirely. Remembering she sifted through fragments, half-forgotten conversations, earlier warnings she had brushed aside, casual moments that now carried ominous weight. She reread old messages from Nick, replayed saved voicemails, studied family photographs that had once felt comforting but now seemed to conceal something else. The signs had never been deeply buried. They had been visible all along. I just didn't want to look, Romy would later admit. Romy finally admitted it to herself. Every new revelation stung a little deeper. The small deceptions, the old resentments that had never been addressed. The quiet tensions that had simmered for years, they were all slowly surfacing. The flawless family portrait everyone had admired was, in reality, only a thin, brittle shell. What ultimately pushed Romy to break her long silence wasn't the media storm or the endless questions. It was something far more intimate, a letter she discovered in her father's study, written just days before the collapse. Those words, restrained yet heavy, offered a different lens on everything and made it clear that the story was far from finished. In the letter, Rob expressed his longing to undo years of accumulated mistakes and his desperate wish to release his family from the mounting disorder. To an outsider, it might have looked like a late, fragile sign of redemption. But for Romy, every sentence carried a shadow. Unspoken anxieties, concealed plans, and a frantic effort to shield Nick by removing him from the situation entirely. That letter became the pivot. For days she carried it, uncertain what action to take. Then one night, listening again to her father's familiar cadence on the page, she realized that staying quiet would not ease the ache, it would only stretch it out. The truth had to be faced, not for punishment or blame, but so the family could eventually find some kind of peace. That was when she chose to speak. In the interview she gave Nick's unraveling mental state and of the long chain of decisions that had slowly turned affection into something crushing. For her, this was not about settling scores. It was about letting go. When she finally stepped back into the public eye after months of absence, the mood shifted noticeably. People had waited, unsure whether she would protect her brother, condemn him, or simply try to fill in the missing pieces. She chose a quiet, unadorned setting, no dramatic lighting, no elaborate staging, just her and the story. As the recording began, her hand shook faintly. Her voice stayed steady but carried deep fatigue. "This isn't about heroes and villains," she said in her opening sentence. The room seemed to hold its breath. She spoke about the weeks before the tragedy, the growing sense that something was terribly wrong and how both she and her father had genuinely believed they were acting to save Nick. "We kept thinking he needed to be repaired," she said, her voice catching. What he actually needed was to be seen. She acknowledged the enormous pressure her father had lived under, The guilt he could never shake, the fear that had shadowed him for so long. When she spoke of Nick, she didn't portray a monster. She described someone who had become lost. He wasn't driven by rage, she said quietly. He was trapped, and when someone feels they have no way out, they can do things that can't be undone. The interview spread rapidly online. Reactions poured in. Some called her brave, others felt she had softened the harshest edges. Yet almost everyone agreed on one thing. Her words gave the fragmented events a coherent shape for the first time. The conflict had roots. The headlines had hidden something profoundly human underneath. Even after the cameras turned off, one question remained unspoken. Had Romy shared everything, or only the portion of the truth she could bear to live with? Her life changed quickly after that. Messages flooded in, analysts dissected every sentence. Social media argued over who carried responsibility. Some thanked her for her candor. Others accused her of reshaping history. She stayed silent. She had said what she felt needed to be said. The rest she chose to hold close. On the surface she appeared composed, but the memories shadowed her constantly. The Brentwood house was sold, the belongings packed away, yet that December night stayed vivid. Sometimes a stranger's profile would briefly resemble Nick's in the stillness before sunrise. She would sometimes hear her father's voice again. Late at night she would mentally replay the interview, wondering whether she had truly told it all, because one piece still remained private, the very last line in her father's letter. If you ever feel completely lost, tell the story. It's the only way you find your way home again. Those words became her compass. Speaking, whether in rare conversations or in pages written after midnight, slowly turned disorder into something she could carry with meaning. As another winter drew near and the anniversary loomed, Romy understood that the story still had more to say, not about guilt or absolution, but about whatever comes after, because at its heart, this was never simply a story of loss. It was about what happens when love, shame, and prolonged silence collide. A full year passed. The news cycle moved on, but for Romy, the quiet work of healing continued. The echoes had not disappeared, they had simply moved inside. Over time, people stopped seeing her as merely background noise and began to recognize her as someone who bravely chose to speak up when staying silent would have been far simpler. A few months later, in a quiet, unrecorded conversation by the darkened seaside, no lights, no audience, just the steady rhythm of the waves, Romy sat and reflected. I used to believe this was a story about loss, she said softly. But I've come to see that, at its heart, it's really about love, a complicated, deeply human kind of love. A gentle smile crossed her face, her eyes carrying both sorrow and a quiet peace. In that moment, the story of Reiner's family ceased to be just another sensational headline. It became something more enduring. A powerful reminder of what can unfold when the truth is finally brought into the light. Thank you for staying with us until the very end, watching, listening, and sharing your thoughts. Your attention and engagement are what keep us motivated to tell these layered, human, and meaningful stories. If this video moved you, made you reflect, or stirred something inside, please consider giving it a like, subscribing if you haven't already, and leaving your thoughts in the comments below. Your support directly helps the channel continue creating content worth your time.